The constable from Little Paddington, a man named Harris, who had held his position for some 12 years with a competence that was reliable if not inspired, arrived within the hour, having been summoned by telephone from the police station in the neighboring town. He was a solid man of middle years, with the kind of face that suggested he had seen enough of human frailty to be neither shocked nor particularly impressed by it, and he set about his work with the methodical approach of someone following a well-worn protocol. The body was examined, measurements were taken, and the assembled villagers were asked to remain in the vicinity pending a more thorough investigation. Inspector Caldwell, a man of some 45 years with sharp features and the piercing blue eyes of someone trained to observe the inconsistencies in human testimony, arrived from the county town by motor car some 90 minutes after the initial discovery, and it became immediately apparent that this death would not be treated as a mere accident or natural conclusion to a long life. The inspector moved through the scene with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command, and he began his inquiries by dividing the crowd into manageable groups and conducting preliminary interviews with systematic precision. It was during these early stages that Miss Marple found herself, quite naturally and without any apparent design on her part, becoming something of a repository for village information. The inspector, having been apprised by Constable Harris that there was an elderly woman of considerable local knowledge present at the fair, had made the decision to speak with her before departing, reasoning that sometimes the keenest observations came from those who were least suspected of making them. Miss Marple sat on a wooden chair that had been brought from one of the fair stalls, her small frame upright and composed, her hands folded in her lap with a kind of serene composure that suggested she was wholly undisturbed by the dramatic turn of events that had so thoroughly disrupted the afternoon's proceedings. The inspector settled himself across from her, his notebook open, his pen poised above the page with the attentiveness of someone prepared to record whatever information might emerge from their conversation. He began with the expected question, asking where Miss Marple had been at the moment when Mr. Thornton had collapsed, and she responded with clear accuracy that she had been at the vegetable stall, selecting her pickled onions, and that she had heard the cry that had brought her to the refreshment tent within moments of the incident occurring. She had not, she explained, seen Mr. Thornton prior to his collapse, nor had she observed him consuming anything from the refreshment tent, though she acknowledged that she had not been watching that particular area with any particular attention. What she had noticed, however, and here her voice took on that characteristic tone of gentle observation that had become her trademark, was that Mr. Thornton had appeared unusually agitated during the morning hours of the fair, moving from stall to stall with a restlessness that seemed inconsistent with his customary demeanor. She had also observed, though she hesitated to mention it, that there had seemed to be a certain tension between Mr. Thornton and Mrs. Blackwell during the preparations for the fair some days prior, a tension of the sort that suggested some disagreement or difficulty of understanding between the two parties. The inspector made a note of this observation, his eyebrows rising slightly in a gesture that suggested surprise at the acuity of Miss Marple's recollection. He then asked, with the kind of directness that characterized his approach, whether Miss Marple had any theories regarding the cause of Mr. Thornton's death, and she responded with the sort of careful circumspection that had served her well over many years of observation. She could not, she explained, possibly presume to understand matters that were properly the province of medical science and police investigation, but she had noticed that the punch bowl seemed to be rather less full than one might have expected at this point in the afternoon, which suggested that either the punch had been particularly popular, or that someone had removed a significant portion of it at some point. The inspector made another note, and thanked Miss Marple for her assistance, though his expression suggested that he considered this information of marginal importance. Yet it was precisely this kind of detail that would later prove to be significant, in ways that neither the inspector nor Miss Marple herself could have anticipated at that particular moment. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, the mechanical processes of investigation began in earnest. Dr. Asherton conducted a preliminary examination of the body, noting certain peculiarities in the presentation of rigor mortis and the coloration of the lips that suggested the possibility of poisoning, though he could not specify the particular substance involved without a more thorough autopsy. The punch bowl itself was removed for analysis, along with samples of the various comestibles that had been served in the refreshment tent. Mrs. Blackwell was questioned extensively regarding the preparation of the punch, the ingredients she had used, and whether anyone else had access to the beverage prior to its service to the gathered guests. She answered all questions with a composure that seemed almost mechanical. Her responses clear and precise, yet there was something in her demeanor that suggested she was operating at some considerable remove from the emotional reality of the situation. By the time evening had settled over the village, with the fair dismantled and the meadow returned to its customary emptiness, it had become apparent that whatever had occurred at Little Paddington's Michaelmas Fair, it had not been a simple accident or the natural consequence of an aging man's declining health. The puzzle, in all its intricate complexity, had only just begun to reveal itself, and Miss Marple, sitting in her cottage in the gathering darkness, found herself contemplating the various threads of the mystery with the kind of patient attention that had come to characterize her approach to understanding human nature and its infinite capacity for concealment and deception. Morning following Mr. Thornton's death dawned grey and uncertain, as though the weather itself had conspired to match the unsettled temperament of Little Paddington's inhabitants. The village, which had always prided itself on being a place where serious crimes did not occur, and where life proceeded according to the orderly rhythms of agricultural seasons and ecclesiastical calendars, found itself transformed overnight into a place of whispered speculation and careful avoidance of direct eye contact. The post office, which traditionally served as the informal hub of village communication, was packed by 9 o'clock, with women ostensibly purchasing stamps and posting parcels, but primarily engaged in the business of constructing theories regarding the cause and perpetrator of Mr. Thornton's demise. Miss Marple, who had always found the post office to be a source of genuine anthropological interest, arrived at precisely 9:30, armed with a parcel destined for her niece in London and an expression of serene indifference to the swirling currents of speculation around her. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell was present, naturally, holding court near the counter, with the authority of someone whose long residence in the village granted her a certain status in matters of communal importance. She was expounding upon her theory that the death was almost certainly connected to some financial impropriety, as Mr. Thornton had been observed visiting the bank on several occasions in recent weeks, behavior that Mrs. Hartwell considered highly suspicious, given that a simple tailor ought to have had no legitimate business with banking establishments. This theory was countered by Mrs. Agnes Pemberton, a woman of some 60 years who had been widowed for a decade and who possessed a particular enthusiasm for the romantic complications of others. Mrs. Pemberton suggested, with considerable confidence, that the death was unquestionably the result of a love affair gone wrong, as she had observed Mr. Thornton speaking with considerable animation to a visiting woman some 3 weeks prior, and she was quite certain that the expression on his face had been that of a man experiencing either profound joy or profound distress, possibly both. Neither Mrs. Hartwell nor any of the other assembled women seemed particularly troubled by the fact that their theories were largely speculative constructions based on minimal evidence and a generous application of imaginative interpretation. It was into this atmosphere of casual gossip that Miss Marple inserted her parcel into the scales, waited patiently while it was weighed and measured, and then turned to engage in the kind of gentle conversation that had become her trademark. She remarked, with the tone of someone making an observation of no particular significance, that she had always found Mr. Thornton to be a conscientious tradesman, though perhaps rather more meticulous than was strictly necessary for the simple business of tailoring. She had noticed, she continued, that his stitching had become progressively more elaborate in recent months, incorporating decorative elements that seemed unnecessarily complex for garments that were primarily meant to be functional. Mrs. Hartwell seized upon this observation immediately, interpreting it as evidence of some form of psychological disturbance, while Mrs. Pemberton suggested that it indicated a man attempting to impress someone through the medium of his work. Miss Marple, having planted this seed of observation, thanked them both for their thoughts and departed with her receipt, leaving behind a village even more thoroughly convinced that they understood the nature of the tragedy that had befallen them. The afternoon brought the arrival of Inspector Caldwell's preliminary findings, delivered by Constable Harris with the solemnity of a man conveying information of grave importance. The punch bowl had indeed contained a substantial quantity of cyanide, a poison of the sort that left distinctive marks upon the tissues of its victim and was not particularly difficult to obtain for anyone with access to the kind of cleaning supplies that might be found in almost any household. The poison had been introduced into the punch sometime during the morning, the analysis suggested, likely several hours before Mr. Thornton's consumption of it, which meant that the perpetrator had deliberately ensured that the beverage contained a lethal substance and then waited with apparent calm for the victim to succumb. This detail, which seemed to many in the village to suggest a degree of premeditation and cold-bloodedness that was almost incomprehensible, had the effect of narrowing the circle of suspects considerably. Everyone present at the fair had access to the refreshment tent, at least in theory. B. The punch had been under the direct supervision of Mrs. Catherine Blackwell for most of the morning, and it was she who had served it to the various guests and general attendees who had requested refreshment. Inspector Caldwell, having absorbed this information and considered it in light of the preliminary interviews conducted the previous day, had arrived at a conclusion that seemed to him to be almost inescapable in its logic. Mrs. Catherine Blackwell, the village schoolteacher, a woman of some 45 years who had never been married and who was known for her impeccable propriety and her dedication to her students, had been identified as the person with the clearest motive and the greatest opportunity to introduce poison into the punch. It had emerged, during more thorough inquiries conducted the morning of Mr. Thornton's death, that some 18 months prior, Mrs. Blackwell had been engaged to be married to a solicitor from the neighboring town, an engagement that had been broken off quite suddenly under circumstances that had never been entirely clear to the village at large. The man in question had subsequently married another woman, and it had been discovered, through the kind of patient investigation that Inspector Caldwell was capable of conducting, that Mr. James Thornton had been instrumental in bringing about this cessation of the engagement, having apparently discouraged the solicitor from proceeding with his commitment to Mrs. Blackwell through means that suggested a prior intimacy between the solicitor and Mr. Thornton. This information, when combined with the fact that Mrs. Blackwell had been the sole controller of the punch, and that she would have ample opportunity to introduce poison into it without observation, had led Inspector Caldwell to the conclusion that he should prepare to make an arrest. Miss Marple, sitting in her cottage in Contam, plating the news as it filtered through the village, found herself troubled by a detail that seemed to trouble no one else, a small inconsistency that nagged at her consciousness like a thread that remained unraveled despite considerable effort to integrate it into the larger tapestry of the narrative she was constructing in her mind. The detail that troubled Miss Marple was, in its own way, almost embarrassingly minor, the sort of observation that one might expect from someone engaged in the kind of obsessive attention to minutiae that characterized those inclined toward pedantry rather than genuine insight. Yet it was precisely this habit of mind, cultivated over decades of careful observation, that had served her well in understanding the true nature of human behavior and the mechanisms by which individuals concealed their intentions beneath layers of apparent normalcy. The troublesome element was the button, that small fragment of mother-of-pearl with its length of new thread, which had lain upon the grass near the refreshment tent, and which Miss Marple had observed with a kind of automatic attention that had become second nature to her. She had, quite deliberately, said nothing about this button to Inspector Caldwell during their conversation, for she had learned through long experience that premature revelation of observations could lead to their misinterpretation by those insufficiently trained in the art of reading human behavior. Instead, she had filed the detail away in that extraordinary memory of hers, cataloguing it alongside the other fragments of information that she accumulated with the patient persistence of someone collecting shells upon a beach, never entirely certain which would prove valuable until the larger pattern began to emerge. It was this button that had caused her to spend much of the night preceding the arrival of Inspector Caldwell's preliminary findings in a state of contemplative wakefulness, turning the problem over in her mind with the methodical approach of someone solving a particularly intricate puzzle. A button made of mother-of-pearl, attached to new thread, lying near the refreshment tent where Mr. James Thornton had consumed the poisoned punch. The button itself was distinctive, the sort of thing one might find on a quality garment rather than on the sort of everyday dress that most village women wore to a church fair. The thread was new, bright white, the sort of thing one used when making repairs to clothing that was meant to be preserved and maintained rather than discarded. And it occurred to Miss Marple, with a kind of sudden clarity that came from allowing one's subconscious mind sufficient time to process apparently disconnected information, that a tailor would know a great deal about buttons and thread. And a tailor would also be precisely the sort of person to notice if a garment was missing a button or if a repair had been made with new rather than matched thread. This realization led her mind down a path that seemed to contradict everything that Inspector Caldwell had concluded, for it suggested that Mr. Thornton had not been merely the victim of Mrs. Blackwell's revenge, but had been engaged in some form of observation or scrutiny of another party present at the fair. Miss Marple rose early on the morning following the discovery of the poison in the punch bowl, dressed herself in her customary attire, and made her way to the village with the apparent intention of engaging in her usual morning errands. In reality, however, she was engaged in a form of reconnaissance, moving through the streets and shops of Little Paddington with the manner of someone simply passing the time in pleasant observation, but actually conducting a systematic examination of the various inhabitants, and their current state of mind and comportment. It was in the window of Mr. Thornton's tailor shop, closed now in the aftermath of his death, that she made her first significant observation. The shop itself had been locked since the morning of the fair, but the window display remained intact, displaying various garments in various states of completion. Among these garments, Miss Marple observed with considerable interest, was a gentleman's waistcoat in a fine wool fabric, and it was upon this waistcoat that her attention focused with an intensity that might have seemed excessive to any observer. The waistcoat displayed a set of buttons that were clearly in the process of being replaced, for 3 of the 4 buttons were new and of matching quality, while the 4th button was noticeably older and of a slightly different shade. Someone had evidently brought the waistcoat to Mr. Thornton for repair, requesting that the buttons be replaced with new ones, but Mr. Thornton, in the meticulous manner that characterized his work, had replaced only 3 of the 4 buttons, perhaps having run out of the matching buttons, or perhaps having been interrupted in his work. This observation, combined with the button found near the refreshment tent, began to suggest a narrative quite different from the one that Inspector Caldwell had constructed. It was not, Miss Marple began to suspect, a case of straightforward revenge by a spurned woman, but rather something far more complex and concerning, something that suggested that Mr. Thornton had been engaged in activities that extended beyond the simple business of tailoring, and that his death might represent something far more sinister than a crime of passion born from romantic disappointment. She spent the remainder of the morning engaged in what appeared to be casual conversation with various village residents, asking gentle questions abu. T, who had recently required tailoring services and who among the wealthier residents of the area might have had dealings with Mr. Thornton regarding more elaborate garments. The answers she received painted a picture that seemed innocuous on its surface, but which, when examined with sufficient care and understanding of the patterns of human behavior that she had accumulated over her lifetime, suggested the possibility of a deception far more fundamental than anyone in the village had yet contemplated. By the time afternoon arrived, and Inspector Caldwell made his way to Mrs. Blackwell's residence with the intention of placing her under arrest, Miss Marple had begun to formulate a theory that seemed to her to be far more plausible than the official narrative that was about to be imposed upon the village, and she found herself in the peculiar position of knowing something that no one else in Little Paddington had yet grasped, a burden of knowledge that would require very careful handling indeed. Inspector Caldwell arrived at the schoolhouse, where Mrs. Catherine Blackwell maintained her residence in one of the adjacent cottages, at precisely 2:30 in the afternoon, accompanied by Constable Harris and bearing with him the kind of official solemnity that characterized the performance of such duties. Mrs. Blackwell received him in her small sitting room, a space decorated with an austere taste that reflected something of her character: functional furniture, carefully selected books, and a distinct absence of the ornamental flourishes that most women of her age and station felt compelled to accumulate. She listened to the charges against her with a composure that seemed to border on the detached, and when offered the opportunity to respond, she neither protested her innocence with the emotional vehemence one might have expected nor confessed to the crime with the kind of relief that sometimes accompanied the unburdening of guilt. Instead, she simply stated, in a tone of voice that suggested she was discussing the weather or some other matter of marginal consequence, that she had indeed introduced cyanide into the punch bowl, and that she had done so with the full knowledge that Mr. James Thornton would consume it. The confession, delivered with such apparent simplicity and directness, seemed to Inspector Caldwell to be precisely the kind of validation that his investigation required, and he proceeded with the formalities of arrest and the reading of rights with the satisfaction of a man whose professional judgment had been vindicated by events. It was only when Mrs. Blackwell had been removed from her cottage and conveyed to the police station in the neighboring town that Miss Marple allowed herself to act upon the convictions that had been forming in her mind throughout the preceding hours. She made her way to the schoolhouse itself, where she requested an audience with the headmaster, a man named Richardson, who had held his position for some 7 years and who possessed the kind of administrative temperament that was more concerned with maintaining order than with investigating the deeper complexities of human motivation. Miss Marple explained, with her characteristic air of diffident uncertainty, that she had some questions regarding the recent movements and activities of various village residents, and that she believed these questions might be of some significance to the proper understanding of the tragic events that had recently occurred. Mr. Richardson, somewhat bemused by the elderly woman's presence and her apparent desire to discuss matters that he presumed had already been resolved through the arrest of Mrs. Blackwell, nevertheless consented to answer her inquiries, for it was difficult to refuse the requests of Miss Marple, without appearing actively uncharitable. The questions Miss Marple posed were carefully constructed, appearing to be simple curiosities about village life, while actually designed to elicit information regarding the movements of several key individuals during the days immediately preceding the Michaelmas Fair. She inquired, for instance, about whether Mr. Richardson had observed any unusual tension among the staff members, whether anyone had seemed particularly preoccupied or distressed, and whether there had been any incidents involving the maintenance or alteration of school property in recent weeks. The answers that emerged from these apparently innocent inquiries gradually revealed a picture that stood in stark contrast to the official narrative that Inspector Caldwell had accepted so readily. It appeared that during the week preceding the fair, there had been a minor incident at the schoolhouse in which a window had been broken and subsequently repaired, and that this repair work had been carried out by Mr. Thornton himself, who had been called upon to replace the damaged glazing and to repair the frame. Furthermore, during this repair work, Mr. Thornton had been observed to conduct what appeared to be a thorough examination of the room in question, moving about with an attention to detail that seemed to Mr. Richardson to exceed what would normally be required for the simple task of window repair. This information, when combined with Miss Marple's earlier observations regarding the button and the careful attention Mr. Thornton had apparently been paying to the details of various garments and structures throughout the village, began to paint a picture of a man engaged in something far more consequential than the simple business of tailoring. Miss Marple excused herself from Mr. Richardson's presence and made her way directly to the tailor shop, where she had preview. Usley obtained a key from the solicitor managing Mr. Thornton's affairs on the grounds that she wished to examine his account books to determine what outstanding debts might exist. This explanation, while not entirely false, was sufficiently transparent in its dishonesty that Miss Marple did not expect it to withstand serious scrutiny, but it had the advantage of being the sort of thing that an elderly woman might reasonably be expected to do under the circumstances, and the solicitor, preoccupied with the complexities of sudden death and unexpected inheritance, had provided the key without extensive questioning. Once inside the shop, Miss Marple moved with a purposefulness that belied her advanced years. directing her attention toward the small room at the back where Mr. Thornton maintained his private workspace and where his personal papers might reasonably be expected to be kept. Here she discovered, tucked beneath a loose floorboard that had been recently disturbed, a series of detailed sketches and measurements of various buildings throughout the village, along with notes written in Mr. Thornton's precise handwriting that detailed observations regarding the security of doors, windows, and other points of entry. These sketches included not only the schoolhouse, but also the post office, the bank, and several residences of individuals of known wealth. It became immediately apparent to Miss Marple that Mr. James Thornton had not been engaged in the innocent business of tailoring alone, but had been conducting a systematic assessment of the village's various properties with the apparent intention of identifying targets for burglary or theft. This realization, combined with the knowledge that Mrs. Blackwell was currently being held in custody for a murder she quite possibly had not committed, created in Miss Marple's mind a sense of urgency that brooked no delay in bring the truth to light, a truth that seemed to suggest that Inspector Caldwell had allowed his assumptions regarding Mrs. Blackwell's guilt to prevent him from considering alternative explanations for Mr. Thornton's death. The sketches and notes that Miss Marple discovered in Mr. Thornton's workshop presented a puzzle that required careful consideration, for they suggested a dimension to the tailor's character that seemed to contradict everything that the village believed it knew about him. A man who had lived quietly in Little Paddington for nearly 3 decades, who had conducted his business with impeccable propriety, and who had maintained a reputation for reliability and discretion, had apparently been engaged in a systematic program of reconnaissance that could only be described as criminal in its intent and preparation. Yet this revelation, while certainly significant, did not directly explain the manner of Mr. Thornton's death or the apparent readiness with which Mrs. Blackwell had confessed to administering the poison. Miss Marple understood, with the kind of clarity that came from years of observing the intersections between human motive and human action, that the presence of these sketches suggested that someone in the village had possessed knowledge of Mr. Thornton's activities, and that this knowledge might well have provided a motive far more compelling than the romantic disappointment that had supposedly driven Mrs. Blackwell to murder. She carefully replaced the sketches and notes in their hiding place, locked the shop behind her, and returned the key to the solicitor with the expression of someone who had found nothing of particular interest. It was only as evening began to settle over Little Paddington that Miss Marple made her way to the police station in the neighboring town, a journey that required the taking of the local omnibus and which left her feeling somewhat fatigued by the time she arrived at her destination. Inspector Caldwell received her with the kind of barely concealed impatience that characterized a man convinced that he had solved a case and who was therefore inclined to regard further inquiries as either frivolous or obstructive. Miss Marple, undeterred by his demeanor, seated herself in the chair across from his desk and began, with her characteristic diffidence, to present a series of observations that she believed might merit his consideration. She explained, in a tone that suggested she was not at all certain of her own conclusions, that she had undertaken some inquiries regarding Mr. Thornton's activities, and that she had discovered evidence suggesting that the tailor had been engaged in activities that extended considerably beyond the simple business of hemming trousers and mending seams. She presented her discovery of the sketches and notes with the careful objectivity of someone presenting facts rather than accusations, and she suggested, with considerable delicacy, that the knowledge of such activities on the part of various village residents might have provided a motive for murder that was quite distinct from the romantic disappointment that had supposedly characterized Mrs. Blackwell's emotional state. Inspector Caldwell listened to her exposition with the kind of attention that suggested he was not entirely convinced of her conclusions, yet there was something in her measured presentation and in the evidence she described that gave him pause. He was, after all, a professional investigator, and while he had become convinced of Mrs. Blackwell's guilt, he was not so rigid in his thinking as to be incapable of reconsidering his position if presented with information of genuine significance. He therefore agreed to accompany Miss Marple to the tailor shop and to examine the evidence she had discovered, and it was during this examination that several additional details began to emerge that had not been apparent during his initial investigation. The sketches themselves revealed not merely a criminal intent, but a sophisticated understanding of security systems and the vulnerabilities of various buildings, suggesting that Mr. Thornton had possessed either considerable experience in criminal enterprises or had been receiving guidance from someone with such experience. Furthermore, there were notations indicating that certain individuals had been marked for particular attention, and among these notations was a reference to Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the village's most prominent and wealthiest resident, whose residence contained not only valuable artwork, but also a significant quantity of jewelry that was known throughout the village to be of considerable monetary worth. This observation, combined with the realization that Mrs. Hartwell had been present at the fair and had been among the first to consume the poisoned punch, began to suggest to Inspector Caldwell that he might have made an error in his initial assessment of the case. He immediately placed a telephone call to the police station requesting that Mrs. Blackwell be held pending further investigation, and he set about the business of re-examining the evidence and the testimonies with a renewed attention to detail. It was Miss Marple who suggested, with her characteristic indirectness, that he might wish to conduct interviews with those individuals who had been in a position to know about Mr. Thornton's criminal activities and who might therefore have possessed a motive to eliminate him before such activities could be brought to light. She suggested, in particular, that a closer examination of the relationships between Mr. Thornton and various members of the village establishment might prove illuminating, and she hinted, with the delicate precision of someone who was not entirely certain she should be speaking at all, that there might be connections between individuals that were not immediately apparent to those engaging in superficial observation. The inspector, humbled somewhat by the revelation that his initial investigation had been conducted with insufficient care, found himself dependent upon the elderly woman's insights in a manner that was not entirely comfortable to him. Yet he was nothing if not professional, and he recognized that Miss Marple possessed an understanding of village dynamics and human motivation that his more formal training had not equipped him to achieve. It was therefore with a sense of reluctant collaboration that he began to pursue the lines of inquiry that she had suggested, lines that would ultimately lead him away from Mrs. Blackwell, and toward a truth far more complex and disturbing than the simple narrative of romantic revenge that he had initially constructed. The interviews that followed over the course of the next several days proved to be considerably more revealing than Inspector Caldwell's initial inquiries had been, for they were conducted with a specific focus upon the relationships between Mr. Thornton and various individuals who possessed both motive and opportunity to eliminate him. It emerged, during these conversations, that Mr. Thornton had apparently been engaged in what might charitably be described as a form of blackmail, using the knowledge he had acquired regarding the vulnerabilities of various buildings to extort sums of money from several prominent village residents under the guise of providing them with security advice. Among those whom he had apparently approached with such proposals was the headmaster, Mr. Richardson, who had been informed that certain irregularities in his management of school funds had been observed, and that Mr. Thornton would be willing to keep silent regarding these matters in exchange for a substantial sum of money. There was also the vicar, Reverend Thomas, who had apparently received similar overtures regarding what Mr. Thornton delicately referred to as certain indiscretions that had been observed during his visits to the vicarage when ostensibly engaged in repair work. These revelations, while certainly damaging to the reputations of the individuals involved, did not immediately clarify the matter of who had actually introduced the cyanide into the punch bowl, for multiple individuals now possessed both motive and the technical knowledge required to commit such an act. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple made an observation that proved to be the crucial turning point in the investigation, an observation so subtle that it might easily have been overlooked by anyone less attentive to the patterns of human behavior. She noted that the button found near the refreshment tent was not, as she had initially suspected, from a garment belonging to Mr. Thornton, but rather appeared to be from a waistcoat of considerably finer quality than anything that Mr. Thornton typically wore. Furthermore, the thread attached to the button was not the sort of repair thread that a careful tailor would ordinarily use, but rather appeared to be hastily applied, suggesting that the button had been attached recently and without the kind of meticulous attention that characterized Mr. Thornton's customary work. This observation led to a series of inquiries regarding who among the village residents might have recently had a garment repaired by Mr. Thornton, and more specifically, who might have lost a button from such a garment during the morning of the fair. The answer that emerged from these investigations proved to be entirely unexpected, for it appeared that the button in question belonged to a waistcoat owned by Mr. Henry Ashford, a gentleman of some 70 years who served as the village magistrate and who was widely regarded as a pillar of respectability and propriety. Mr. Ashford had indeed brought a waistcoat to Mr. Thornton for repair some 3 weeks prior to the fair, requesting that the buttons be replaced with new ones, and it appeared that during the fitting of these new buttons, Mr. Thornton had made certain observations regarding Mr. Ashford's personal affairs that had led him to believe that he had identified yet another opportunity for profitable blackmail. The crucial detail that Miss Marple identified, however, was that the button found near the refreshment tent bore a specific pattern of thread marks that suggested it had been attached and then removed and reattached multiple times, and that the THR-E'd currently attached to it was distinctly different in character from the thread that would normally have been used by a careful tailor. This observation suggested to Miss Marple that Mr. Ashford himself had removed the button from his waistcoat and then deliberately placed it near the refreshment tent, not as an accident, but as a calculated piece of misdirection designed to draw suspicion away from himself and toward whoever might be presumed to have had opportunity to handle his clothing. Inspector Caldwell was initially skeptical of this interpretation, for it seemed to suggest a level of premeditation and sophistication that seemed incongruent with the apparent impulsiveness of the crime. Yet, when confronted with the evidence regarding the pattern of thread marks and the unusual character of the attachment, even the inspector was forced to acknowledge that Miss Marple's interpretation possessed considerable merit. A more thorough examination of Mr. Ashford's movements during the morning of the fair revealed that he had been observed in close proximity to the refreshment tent on several occasions, and that he had specifically been noted by several witnesses to be engaged in what appeared to be an animated conversation with Mrs. Blackwell regarding the preparation of the punch. Furthermore, it emerged that Mr. Ashford had been among those upon whom Mr. Thornton had made his blackmail demands, and that Mr. Ashford had apparently agreed to pay the requested sum, but had then thought better of this capitulation and had begun to consider more permanent solutions to the problem. Inspector Caldwell, having now been presented with evidence that seemed to point toward Mr. Ashford rather than toward Mrs. Blackwell, found himself confronted with the necessity of conducting an entirely new investigation into the magistrate's activities and movements. Yet before this new investigation could properly commence, Miss Marple made one final observation that seemed to illuminate the entire matter with sudden and terrible clarity. An observation that suggested that the true nature of the crime was far more complicated than even the revelation of Mr. Thornton's blackmail activities had suggested. The poisoning, Miss Marple suggested with a tone of voice that indicated she was not entirely comfortable with her own conclusions, appeared to have been the result of a conspiracy rather than the act of a single individual, a conspiracy that had been born from the convergence of multiple motives and the careful orchestration of events by two women whose lives had been profoundly disrupted by Mr. Thornton's discovery of their secrets. Mrs. Catherine Blackwell, it seemed, had agreed to introduce the cyanide into the punch bowl, not primarily out of a desire for revenge against Mr. Thornton for his supposed role in destroying her engagement, but rather out of a complicated mixture of emotions that included gratitude toward Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, who had apparently offered her both friendship and financial security in exchange for her assistance in eliminating the man who threatened to expose them both. The arrangement had been carefully constructed, Miss Marple explained, with Mrs. Hartwell providing the poison itself, which he had obtained through connections related to her late husband's business interests, while Mrs. Blackwell had agreed to introduce it into the punch with the understanding that the act would be attributed to her alone and that she would receive both monetary compensation and the protection of Mrs. Hartwell's considerable influence in ensuring that her situation would be handled with discretion and compassion. Inspector Caldwell found this interpretation difficult to accept initially, for it seemed to suggest that Mrs. Blackwell, a woman of apparent virtue and propriety, had knowingly participated in a premeditated murder, and that she had then deliberately confessed to the crime with the apparent intention of protecting her accomplice. Yet when confronted with the evidence of Mrs. Blackwell's financial circumstances, which had suddenly improved dramatically in the weeks following her confession, and when presented with testimony regarding the intimacy that had developed between the two women in the period preceding the fair, even the skeptical inspector was forced to acknowledge that Miss Marple's interpretation possessed considerable plausibility. The crucial piece of evidence that seemed to crystallize this understanding concerned a letter that had been discovered among Mrs. Hartwell's papers during the course of a more thorough examination of her residence. The letter, written in Mrs. Blackwell's distinctive handwriting, expressed a gratitude that seemed to exceed what would ordinarily be expected for a simple act of friendship, and it contained references to our arrangement and the sacrifice you have made on my behalf that seemed to suggest a transaction of considerable significance. Furthermore, the letter contained an explicit acknowledgement that Mrs. Blackwell understood the true nature of Mrs. Hartwell's relationship with the solicitor, and that she harbored no resentment toward her benefactor for the role that this relationship had played in the dissolution of her own engagement. This letter, combined with the testimony of various villagers who had observed the two women together in the weeks preceding the fair, painted a portrait of a relationship that had evolved from one of casual acquaintance to one of genuine intimacy and mutual dependency. Inspector Caldwell therefore found himself confronted with a moral and legal dilemma of considerable complexity, for the evidence suggested that both women had participated in the commission of murder, yet one of them had already confessed and submitted herself to legal custody, while the other, by virtue of her wealth and social position, possessed the resources necessary to mount a formidable legal defense. Yet Miss Marple's observation regarding the nature of the conspiracy provided Inspector Caldwell with a crucial insight into how the case might be properly resolved, for it suggested that the crime had not been committed by a single individual acting out of passion or impulse, but rather by two individuals whose participation had been driven by distinct and separable motives. Mrs. Blackwell's confession, interpreted in light of this understanding, appeared to be not an act of guilt but an act of sacrifice, a deliberate choice to accept legal responsibility for a crime that had, in some sense, been imposed upon her by circumstances and by the influence of a more powerful personality. This realization led Inspector Caldwell to conduct interviews with both women simultaneously, presenting them with the evidence and the interpretation that Miss Marple had constructed, and watching carefully for the reactions that would indicate whether his understanding of the situation was accurate. It was during these interviews that the full truth of the matter began to emerge, as Mrs. Blackwell, confronted with the knowledge that her sacrifice was being understood for what it truly was, broke down and provided a detailed confession that implicated Mrs. Hartwell not merely as an accomplice, but as the true architect of the crime, the individual who had conceived of the plan and who had manipulated Mrs. Blackwell into participating through a combination of emotional pressure and financial inducement. Mrs. Hartwell, for her part, maintained her composure and denied all involvement, yet her denial was undermined by the various pieces of evidence that Miss Marple had carefully identified and assembled, pieces that, when examined, collectively painted a portrait of premeditation and calculated cruelty that seemed almost incomprehensible in its implications. Miss Marple's final and most crucial test of Mrs. Hartwell came not through the presentation of forensic evidence or through the detailed reconstruction of events, but rather through a carefully orchestrated psychological encounter designed to expose the fundamental inconsistency between the persona that Mrs. Hartwell had constructed for public consumption and the reality of her actions and motivations. She arranged, through Inspector Caldwell's cooperation, to be present during one of the final interviews with Mrs. Hartwell, ostensibly as a concerned village elder offering support to a friend in distress, but actually positioned to observe the subtle reactions that might reveal the truth of the woman's character and culpability. During this interview, Miss Marple engaged Mrs. Hartwell in what appeared to be casual conversation regarding the nature of friendship and loyalty, the obligations that individuals owed to one another, and the terrible consequences that sometimes flowed from the well-intentioned actions of people who allowed sentiment to override judgment. She spoke, with the kind of gentle authority that characterized her manner of address, about a situation she had once observed in her own village many years prior, a situation in which a woman of considerable means had manipulated a more vulnerable individual into committing an act that the vulnerable individual would never have chosen to perform of her own volition. As Miss Marple recounted this story, she watched Mrs. Hartwell's face with the attention of a scientist observing a chemical reaction, noting the precise moment at which the woman's carefully maintained composure began to falter, the instant at which her eyes betrayed knowledge and understanding that transcended what she had thus far admitted to possessing. It was a moment of barely perceptible vulnerability, a crack in the facade that lasted only seconds before Mrs. Hartwell recovered her composure. Yet it was sufficient to confirm what Miss Marple had already concluded regarding the truth of the matter. The psychological pressure of being observed and understood by someone whose insight seemed to penetrate to the very core of one's motivations and character proved to be more effective than any amount of forensic evidence or legal testimony might have been. Within the hour following Miss Marple's departure from the interview room, Mrs. Hartwell requested the presence of her solicitor and began to provide a detailed account of the planning and execution of the crime that differed significantly from the version that she had thus far maintained. She acknowledged that she had obtained the cyanide through her late husband's business connections, that she had approached Mrs. Blackwell with the proposal that they collaborate in eliminating Mr. Thornton, and that she had deliberately positioned a button from Mr. Ashford's waistcoat near the refreshment tent as a means of introducing confusion into the investigation and deflecting suspicion away from both herself and her accomplice. She explained that her motivation had derived not merely from a desire to protect herself from the consequences of Mr. Thornton's blackmail, but from a deeper and more complex emotion rooted in her sense that the world had treated her with profound injustice, that her years of careful cultivation of respectability and position had been rendered meaningless by the discovery of a single indiscretion, and that she had therefore decided to take control of her own fate by eliminating the individual who possessed the power to destroy her. The confession was delivered with a kind of terrible clarity, as though the act of finally acknowledging the truth had liberated her from the burden of maintaining her pretense, and it provided Inspector Caldwell with all of the information that he required to bring formal charges against both women. Yet as Miss Marple listened to Mrs. Hartwell's account, she found herself feeling not satisfaction at having solved the puzzle, but rather a profound sadness, rooted in her understanding of how human weakness and human fear could combine to produce such terrible consequences. She understood, in the way that only years of observation could have taught her, that Mrs. Hartwell had not been driven by evil in the way that one might ordinarily understand that concept, but rather by a desperate and ultimately self-destructive attempt to preserve a sense of self and identity that had become inextricably bound to the approval of her community. The trials that followed during the subsequent months proved to be a matter of considerable public attention, for the revelation that two women of apparent virtue had conspired to commit murder struck at the very heart of the village's understanding of propriety and social order. Mrs. Blackwell, whose participation had clearly been coerced and manipulated, received a sentence that reflected the court's understanding of her circumstances, though she was nonetheless required to serve a period of imprisonment. Mrs. Hartwell, whose role as the architect and primary instigator of the crime was clear, received a considerably more substantial sentence, and it was during her removal from the courtroom, following the pronouncement of sentence, that she looked directly at Miss Marple with an expression that seemed to combine resignation, understanding, and a kind of terrible gratitude for having been finally seen and understood for what she truly was. The weeks and months that followed the sentencing of Mrs. Hartwell and Mrs. Blackwell saw little Paddington gradually return to the external rhythms of village life, though an undercurrent of unease and uncertainty seemed to have become permanently woven into the fabric of the community's consciousness. The shops reopened, the church services resumed their customary attendance, and the various social institutions that had been disrupted by the revelation of such profound betrayal among their most trusted members gradually reasserted themselves as though normalcy could be re-established through the sheer force of routine and habit. Yet those who observed the village with any degree of attention could not help but notice that something fundamental had shifted in the relationships between the inhabitants, a subtle recognition that the comfortable certainties upon which they had built their social structures were far more fragile than they had previously acknowledged. Inspector Caldwell, having completed his work in Little Paddington and having moved on to other cases in other villages, made a point of calling upon Miss Marple before his final departure from the area, ostensibly to thank her for her assistance, but actually driven by a desire to understand how she had perceived the truth so clearly when his own training and experience had initially led him astray. He found her in her garden on a clear October afternoon, engaged in the simple task of preparing her beds for the approaching winter, her hand still capable, despite her advanced years, her movements economical and precise. The inspector seated himself on a nearby bench and began to ask his questions with a kind of professional humility that suggested he had learned something significant during the course of the investigation that had altered his understanding of his own capabilities and limit. Miss Marple responded with her characteristic modesty, suggesting that she had merely observed what was plainly visible to anyone willing to look carefully enough at the details of human behavior and the patterns that such behavior revealed. She explained that the button had initially struck her as anomalous precisely because it did not fit into the narrative that everyone seemed eager to construct regarding Mrs. Blackwell's guilt, and that once she had begun to question the official account of events, other inconsistencies had gradually revealed themselves to her attention. The inspector asked her whether she had been certain of her conclusions before confronting Mrs. Hartwell during that final interview. And Miss Marple responded with a kind of gentle honesty that suggested she had indeed been quite certain, though she had not been entirely confident that the psychological pressure she had attempted to apply would prove sufficient to break through the woman's carefully constructed defenses. She admitted that she had harbored some doubt regarding whether her interpretation of events would ultimately prove to be correct, for the human mind was capable of constructing narratives of remarkable complexity and plausibility, and it was always possible that her own understanding, however carefully constructed, might prove to be fundamentally mistaken. Yet she had felt compelled to act upon her convictions because the alternative, allowing an innocent woman to be imprisoned for a crime that she had not committed in the way that everyone believed, seemed to her to be a form of moral cowardice that she could not in good conscience accept. Inspector Caldwell reflected upon this response for some time before asking whether Miss Marple had experienced any satisfaction upon discovering that her conclusions had proven to be correct, and she responded with a kind of sadness that seemed to encompass both the specific tragedy of the case and some larger understanding of the human condition itself. She explained that she had felt no satisfaction whatsoever, only a kind of melancholy rooted in her comprehension of how two women, each of whom possessed qualities that might ordinarily be considered admirable, had allowed fear and desperation to drive them toward actions that had destroyed their lives and caused immeasurable harm to their community. She reflected that the tragedy was not merely that a man had been murdered, though that was certainly tragic, but that two women who might have lived out their remaining years in relative peace and dignity had instead chosen to compromise their fundamental integrity in ways that could never be repaired or reversed. The inspector found himself moved by the depth of Miss Marple's reflection, and he began to understand, perhaps for the first time in his career, that the solution to a crime was not merely a matter of establishing guilt and innocence through the accumulation of evidence and the analysis of motive and opportunity, but rather a process through which the investigator came to understand something profound about the nature of human weakness and human strength, about the ways in which ordinary people might be driven to extraordinary actions under sufficient pressure and duress. As he prepared to depart from Little Paddington, the inspector found himself reflecting that he had learned more from an elderly woman with no official training in criminology than he had learned from all of his years at the police academy and all of his subsequent experience in the field. He expressed this sentiment to Miss Marple, who received it with a kind of embarrassed pleasure, suggesting that what she had done was merely the application of careful observation and a willingness to suspend judgment long enough to Al. Lo, the truth to reveal itself, rather than to force the facts to conform to a predetermined narrative. It was this quality, the inspector realized, that separated the truly exceptional investigator from the merely competent one, the ability to remain open to surprise and to recognize that human behavior, while not random, was rarely so simple or comprehensible as one might initially suppose. As he drove away from Little Paddington in the gathering darkness of an October evening, Inspector Caldwell found himself contemplating the mystery not as a puzzle that had been solved, but as a window into the profound complexity of human motivation and the terrible consequences that could flow from the intersection of individual weakness and circumstantial pressure. The winter that descended upon Little Paddington in the months following the conclusion of the Thornton case brought with it a quality of introspection and recalibration that seemed to permeate every aspect of village life. The Christmas season, ordinarily a time of unalloyed festivity and communal celebration, took on a more subdued character, as though the inhabitants recognized that the comfortable illusions upon which they had built their social relationships had been fundamentally compromised by the revelation of such profound deception existing beneath the surface of apparent respectability. Miss Marple observed these changes with the kind of philosophical acceptance that characterized her approach to the human condition, understanding that communities, like individuals, required time to process trauma and to gradually reconstruct their understanding of themselves and their relationships. She continued her customary routines with undiminished dedication, attending church services, tending her garden, and engaging in the gentle social intercourse that had always characterized her interactions with her neighbors. Why, there was about her a kind of removed quality, as though she had seen something in the course of the investigation that had altered her fundamental understanding of human nature in ways that could never be entirely reversed. It was not until late in the new year, when the snow had begun to melt and the first tentative signs of spring began to appear in the gardens and hedgerows, that Miss Marple found herself reflecting more systematically upon the lessons that the Thornton case had taught her about the nature of truth and the responsibility that came with the possession of insight into the actions and motivations of others. She sat one afternoon in her sitting room, her knitting idle in her lap, and contemplated the peculiar burden that had come to characterize her later years, the recognition that she possessed an ability to perceive truth that most people did not share, and the corresponding responsibility that this ability imposed upon her to ensure that such truth was brought to light in ways that served justice, rather than merely satisfying curiosity or demonstrating the cleverness of the investigator. The case had raised questions in her mind that seemed to transcend the specific circumstances of the deaths of Mr. Thornton and the fate of Mrs. Blackwell and Mrs. Hartwell. She found herself wondering whether the pursuit of truth was always justified, whether there were circumstances under which the maintenance of pleasant illusions might serve humanity better than the revelation of uncomfortable realities, and whether the law itself was always an adequate vehicle for the pursuit of justice in all of its complexity and nuance. These reflections did not lead her to any definitive conclusions, but rather seemed to deepen her understanding that the relationship between knowledge and action was far more complicated than she had once supposed, and that the exercise of the investigative gift with which she had been endowed carried with it obligations and responsibilities that extended far beyond the simple mechanics of solving crimes. As spring advanced and the village began its slow return to the full rhythm of seasonal life, Miss Marple received a letter from Mrs. Blackwell, who had by this time been released from her imprisonment following a reduction of her sentence based on evidence of her coercion by Mrs. Hartwell and her cooperation with authorities. The letter was written in Mrs. Blackwell's careful handwriting, and it expressed a gratitude for Miss Marple's role in ensuring that the truth of the matter had been brought to light, combined with a complex acknowledgement of the ways in which that truth had complicated rather than simplified the moral and emotional landscape of her own existence. Mrs. Blackwell explained that she had chosen to leave Little Paddington and to establish herself in a distant town where she might attempt to construct some kind of meaningful life in the aftermath of her experiences, though she acknowledged that the shadow of her participation in the crime would likely follow her for the remainder of her days. She expressed a kind of philosophical resignation regarding this fate, suggesting that she had come to understand that actions carried consequences that could not be escaped through distance or the passage of time, and that the best one could hope for was to live with some degree of integrity in the aftermath of one's failures. Miss Marple found herself moved by this letter in ways that she could not entirely articulate, for it suggested that, even in the aftermath of such profound tragedy and moral failure, there remained some possibility for redemption and growth, however limited and constrained by the circumstances that had been created through one's own actions. The letter from Mrs. Hartwell, L., which arrived several weeks later, proved to be quite different in character and tone. Written from the prison in which she was serving her sentence, it expressed no regret and no acknowledgement of moral failure, but rather a kind of defiant justification of her actions rooted in her conviction that society had treated her with profound injustice and that she had merely taken control of her own destiny in the only way that circumstances had permitted. The letter suggested that Mrs. Hartwell had constructed a narrative in which she was the victim rather than the perpetrator of the crime, and that she had come to believe that her actions, however terrible in their immediate consequences, represented some form of protest against the arbitrary judgments and limitations that society imposed upon individuals of her class and gender. Miss Marple found this letter deeply troubling, for it suggested that even the revelation of truth and the imposition of legal consequences had proven insufficient to penetrate the defensive structures that Mrs. Hartwell had constructed around her understanding of herself and her actions. Yet she recognized that such resistance to truth was not unusual, and that many individuals were capable of maintaining self-deceptions of remarkable complexity in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. As the spring gave way to summer, and the village settled back into its customary patterns of life and activity, Miss Marple found herself increasingly occupied with the kinds of reflections that seemed to occupy the minds of those approaching the end of their earthly existence. She contemplated the nature of the gift that she had been given, the ability to perceive truth in human behavior and to understand the complex motivations that drove individuals toward both virtue and vice. She considered whether this gift had made her life richer and more meaningful, or whether it had merely burdened her with knowledge that she would have been happier not to possess. In the end, however, she came to the conclusion that the pursuit of truth, however difficult and however complicated in its consequences, represented something essential to the maintenance of a just and orderly society, and that the responsibility to employ one's gifts in service of this pursuit was not something that could be shirked or avoided without doing violence to one's own integrity and character. And so Miss Marple continued, as she always had, in her quiet way, observing the village and its inhabitants with the patient attention that had become second nature to her, knowing that in some future moment some other mystery would require her particular gifts, and that she would respond to that requirement with the same gentle determination that had characterized her entire approach to the business of understanding human nature and bringing truth to light.